For those of you who just joined us, welcome to Effective Flood Communication, Simple Strategies for Outreach That Works. We are very honored to be joined by Keri Stephens, who will be our expert today, sharing her presentation on this topic. Thank you so much for joining. There is a poll question. Feel free to answer it, but no worries if you do miss it as well. It looks like it's kind of stopping now, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Okay. So first question is, what has been most effective for you regarding communicating with your residents on flood risk? Website seems like it's the #1 answer, and in-person meetings is the second, with mailers and email following. Keri, was this what you were expecting?
I would say definitely this combination of website and in-person meeting, but I have a feeling that if you had put Facebook up there, we would have
Yeah,
actually gotten a fair number of people who would have said Facebook is
that totally
actually a
makes
great way
sense.
to connect.
Yeah. And chime in on the chat if Facebook is your other, or if you did put other, sort of what that other was, we would love to hear about that. And then just for fun, if you celebrate Thanksgiving, what is your favorite dish? We have a majority, no, not a majority, but we have the most people answering stuffing, and then second to that, turkey. And then I guess, Keri, were you expecting that answer as well?
You know what? Yes, because I'm not a stuffing person and everybody else seems
Mm.
to love it. So
Yeah, I also would have answered stuffing, but I do think there's a wide variety of stuffing quality. So it's one of those that you kind of have to go and trust. Well, thank you everyone for answering the poll questions. Very excited to be bearing witness to this presentation from Keri today with you all. It's called Effective Flood Communication, Simple Strategies for Outreach That Works. I'll do a quick introduction. So those of you who've come to our webinars before, you've probably memorized this alongside me, but we're recording this presentation so you will get it as well as the presentation Keri is sharing after this. So don't worry about like taking screenshots or taking like copious notes, etc. If you would like to ask any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat. I'll gather all those questions together and we'll ask Keri at the end. And if you are a CFM, there's a post-attendee survey to receive your CEC, and then we'll send that to you via email. And then we'll also send the list to ASFPM to sort of help you out on the documentation front of things. And the last thing is, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Usually people say sort of like who they are and where they're calling in from, I guess. Okay, so by way of introduction, to start, I just want to give you some context on our webinars more broadly. I'm one of the founders of a software company called Forerunner. We build floodplain management software for our partner communities. They run the gamut in terms of size. They span the country. We have the privilege of working with now over 120 of them. And that means that we're able to see how floodplain management is done across the country, which is a great privilege. We started this webinar series to help with knowledge sharing because we were starting to identify, things that people wanted to learn more about, et cetera. And then we're in a privileged position to be able to invite people like Keri to come speak to you all. So thank you so much for giving us that opportunity as well. If you're not familiar with Forerunner, we are software designed to empower government agencies to do more with respect to things like flood compliance and public education. We're specifically really excited to hear from Keri today because for those of you who are familiar with Forerunner, one of the big things we do is work with our partners to help make property level flood risk information available to them via a website. So happy to see that a lot of you have great public websites as well. And I think through that work, we sort of talk with a lot of communities that are concerned about whether or not they're reaching out to their partner or their residents through the right channels, or whether or not their messaging is correct, et cetera. So I think this topic is incredibly meaningful to a lot of the people that we talk to on a daily basis. And so hopefully you feel the same as well. And with that, I am excited to introduce Keri. And so here's a picture of her, but you actually also see her live. And I'm going to stop screen sharing so that she can pull up her presentation while I introduce her. Okay, go ahead and screen share while I'm doing this. But so Professor Keri Stephens is the social scientist leading the flood communication effort for the state of Texas through her work with the Texas Water Development Board. I do see a few people from Texas in the audience, so excited for that. the Institute for a Disaster Resilient Texas, and also Planet Texas 2050, which is a lot of organizations to be working with. She has a bajillion accolades. I think it would take the entire time of this to highlight them all, but a couple that I thought to call out were she's a fellow with the International Communication Association. She's also given TED Talks on both hurricanes and floods. And she is a professor of organizational communication technology and also the co-director of the Technology and Information Policy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin, which is the truncated version, but know that she's doing a bajillion other things as well. And with that, I will mute and hand it off. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you, everybody. I'm excited to see that people are from all over the U.S. And hopefully some of the things that I'm sharing here will be helpful for your communities as well. So let's get started. And one of the things that I find is really complex in communicating flood information is this gap between technical information and then non-technical users. So I count myself as a technical expert, and a lot of times what we do is we go out there and we find these great technical solutions. And then it's literally just like, my gosh, why can't we just get other people to implement these good ideas? But you know what? Human behavior is not often considered whenever we model our flood risk or consider it, because human behavior is messy. The other thing is we often treat our users as passive recipients of information. And what I mean by that is we give them information, but we don't really engage in a lot of dialogue around what they actually want or need. So let's talk a bit about people and human behavior. You know, they often ignore information that's too technical or it's not relevant for them. The other thing they do is, you know, I wish I could say they're always influenced by the best information and technical experts, but that's not the case. And a lot of the reason it is not the case is that they need to trust the information and the source of the information. And then finally, a lot of people forget that humans are just not rational decision makers. We make a lot of emotional decisions, and that makes it really hard, I think, for us to communicate. So in Texas, some of what we've done over the last few years is we're really trying to transition the way we're thinking about the public and other less technical audiences away from this idea that we're just sending them information as passive recipients, but instead we're kind of pulling them on our team, and we're making them active participants to try to make our systems and processes better with the goal that we're improving lives. So we really need some tools to bridge that gap between technical knowledge and flood action. And so today what I'm going to talk about are really two primary buckets of information, and then I'll also answer questions about a lot of other projects going on in the state. One is I'm going to share some flood knowledge projects that have been done, and then I'll also talk about the way that we're looking at community involvement to be able to really develop flood-related tools that meet needs. So first of all, in terms of flood-related products, my team got involved with the Texas Water Development Board in about 2018, 2019. And one of the first things that we came up with is local flood officials, like a lot of people on here, certified floodplain managers, folks who do building codes, all the way to mayors and various county officials. They don't have really at their fingertips access to the latest information. And so we created a guide. I'm going to show you some about that. And then the next project that we did was really kind of diving in and figuring out, how do we prioritize different groups of people to receive flood information? And I'm going to share some details about that as well. So here is our guide that we created. You can actually just Google Flood Resource Guide Texas, and this will come up. It's on the Texas Water Development Board's webpage. And what we really tried to do here is we did a lot of research to put the guide together. We did literature reviews. I'm an academic. We do those kind of things a lot. We also did interviews with some kind of key flood officials and experts in the space. We conducted a survey of Texans, really focused on people who live in flood prone areas compared to people who live in non-flood prone areas. And some of the best practices that we identified in the interviews were, and this is something Florida does great, and I saw several of you are from Florida. In Texas, we tend to only talk about flooding at certain times of the year, and that'll be pretty much in the spring, and then along the coast, whenever it's hurricane season, we talk about hurricane season. And I'll add one more tip for those of y'all on the West Coast. We actually have up in El Paso area, they actually call it monsoon season. And it's a little different than hurricane season on our Gulf Coast. And so one of the key best practices is that we need to be talking about flooding throughout the year. And I'll go a step further and say, whenever I visited Florida, the evacuation routes are up year round. And the evacuation shelter information is actually up year round. And I think that as we start to see flooding increase, if you're in an area where flooding might happen year round, I think we need to be talking about it a lot more. Another one is the public does not understand how water flows. They also don't understand drainage ditches, and they don't understand that some roads are created with the goal of flooding the road so that it doesn't get into homes and businesses. And so another key takeaway was we've got to work on helping the public better understand their hydrology, but we don't want to use that word because it'll scare too many people away. Another thing we need to do is we need to talk about the fact that flood risk is, everybody has it. It's just to varying degrees, but probabilities and talking about 100-year floodplains and 1% chance per year, public doesn't understand that. And another thing we need to do is be more transparent about our risk and insurance and fees, mitigation. And a real tricky thing that's happened, I think, recently are these changing floodplains. People don't understand that when they bought land or built a house that they might not have been at as high of risk, and now all of a sudden they're at a much higher risk. I would also add that the amount of development that we've done is really changing risk. The public doesn't understand that well either. A lot of people want to use video. And so short, simple videos are the way to go. Not these long, drawn out, let's educate people, but quick and to the point. And then we want to make our flood materials accessible and have them appear in search engines. I'm amazed at how many times I've talked with technical organizations and I've found that they don't even know what search engine optimization is. And you know what? If you're not playing the game of getting your websites up there where people can Google them and find them, and if you're not staying on top of some of the AI-based tools that are coming out and working behind these search engines, people are not going to find the information that you put up there. And then finally, kind of a best practice identified was to really focus on community outreach. And I will tell you, it does take a lot of money to do this, but it makes all the difference in the world whenever we can involve the community. So let me show you a few things in this guide. A lot of what we did is with every section, we have a brief, very brief overview, and we identified and ranked the top 3 resources for every one of the topics in here. And then we have, of course, descriptions and links to resources. And one of the reasons we took this approach is that flood officials are busy and a lot of people don't have time. And not everybody prioritizes outreach. And so being able to go in and quickly identify things that you can share seemed to be a real concern and need in our flood officials. And then whenever there are links to video resources, we put those in there as well. Now you're going to notice that most of the things we have in this are Texas specific, but we do link to some FEMA resources and we link to Spanish resources because around 29% of the households in Texas speak Spanish. And so we need everything in English and Spanish all the time. And then we have a lot of different kinds of resources in here as well. So now that I talked about that flood official guide, I want to move and I want to talk about how we identified 4 prioritized groups in terms of the needs and decisions that they need to make around flooding, and talk some about how we're planning to launch these as well in the state. So one of the first things that we realized is that very consistently people in Texas who are communicating with the public are using resources from FEMA, which are good resources, but a lot of times they literally have dates on them of 2015 or 2016. They're old, and they're also not targeted to the communities that the local officials serve. And so we came up with and did research around a general message that'll tap into Texas. So how many of you have heard the "don't mess with Texas" saying? Have any of you heard that? Those of you in Texas probably have, but essentially what it is it's an anti-littering campaign. And do any of you know what age demographic was littering the most and they were going after with this campaign? Probably not surprising, 18 to 35-year-old males. And so one of the cool things about this campaign, and we researched it, is it tapped into Texas culture, this individualistic, rugged type of culture. And so what we did is we iterated on a message for the state to use, and we included Spanish speakers in here. And this is the general message that we have come up with: Texans fight floods together. And I'll tell you in a minute how easy it is to customize these resources that we created. So the second group is that young adult male group. My goodness, they're the ones who are also most likely to drive through floodwaters. And in Texas, we hear that quite often they'll feel very invincible and they'll say things like, "I have a truck. My goodness, I'm not going to get hurt driving through that water." You've all probably heard these same kind of responses. Very different responses from our young female focus group participants. They actually would say, "Well, I don't want to die." Yeah, I think that matters to me. But the young males really had this very invincible attitude. Now we started asking, okay, 18 to 35-year-olds, they don't own a home yet, for the most part. So their most prized possession, it's that truck, it's that vehicle. And as we talked with them about what might make a difference, they all talked about insurance on those vehicles being really high. So we created personas. I'm not a marketing person, but what I did is I pulled in my advertising and marketing colleagues. We created these user personas to better understand kind of what's going on in the mind of that 18 to 35-year-old male. And then we developed 2 different messages for these young adults. Now, I will tell you that this is the final message. The message that really works fantastic is insurance is high. Keep your car dry, because that makes salient your pocketbook that quickly. However, keep your car high and dry also works pretty well. And the messages have been tested, but like I said, I don't have an advertising agency that I work with, and so the graphics are going to be further developed by TWDB at this point. So the next target group that we focused on are new Texans. I think we've learned a whole lot about groups of people who are moving into new communities, and they often bring with them the knowledge that they had of how flooding happened where they were before, or maybe it never happened and they don't even think they have a risk. Well, in Texas, we have the most number of people moving into our state of any state, and most are moving into an area that we call Flash Flood Alley. And that's the center part of the state, not close to the coast. And so it's really kind of shocking to newcomers when they're like, "Wait, why are we getting flooded when we're not close to water?" Now, the other area is very close to water, and that's Harris County. And that's right along the Gulf Coast. And it is, of course, subject to a lot of hurricanes and flooding. The other thing we learned is that new Texans are moving primarily into urban areas. and they have more and more risk of flash floods, as well as drainage related flooding that's happening in communities. And they don't have a clue about what they might need to do to take care of their yards so that excess leaves and trash do not flow into these drainage ditches and cause additional flooding. So the message that we developed targeted to newcomers was really based on this idea that when people are new, they're curious. They're having to sign up for their utilities, right? They have kind of an info-seeking nature about them. And it's really important to include easy ways for them to access information, like a QR code. But I would say in Texas, and actually the US wide, there is no easy to use tool where the public can go in and really look up what their flood risk is. I know FEMA's doing a lot, and I have seen their latest flood risk index. It's still hard for people to understand. And so what our message is doing is we have developed the message, check your flood risk. However, if you go to texasflood.org, it hasn't been developed out yet. But I love the fact that Texas got that URL. And so over time, the idea is they're going to develop that out so that people can access a QR code, go there, and be able to see some of the outputs in usable ways that have been being generated in Texas over the last few years. Now, another group that we really feel like needs to be targeted is older adults. They're growing. We tested the FEMA materials that came out 2023. They came out late fall 2023. And we found that when we gave the booklets and we printed them in large size fonts to older adults, they literally would close them and say, can you just tell me what the priorities are? What do I need to prepare? And as you all know, preparation varies by person, right? And so we thought about ways to help them manage that overload. And also we want to encourage them to talk to other people, because a lot of times, kind of depending on how old someone is, whether they have a mobility disability, a lot of those considerations, relying and communicating with others is really important. So the idea behind our message here is take 5 minutes today and prep 5 items. Tomorrow, sit down and take 5 more minutes and prep 5 more items. So break preparedness down into digestible chunks. And by the way, I've tested this with people of all age groups, and it works pretty well for everyone, because it's very easy for people to feel like getting prepared for a flood is an overwhelming activity. I mentioned a while ago our Spanish speakers in Texas. That is another prioritized group. And one of the things that we are really doing is trying to encourage people to not just translate information, but to really use some cultural understanding in their messages, because pure translation doesn't always work. There's some fantastic research coming out with researchers affiliated with NOAA and NWS around the fact that your country of origin might impact how you view warning words. So alerta means different things to someone who is from Mexico as opposed to Bolivia or Cuba. And so I want us all to remember that Spanish is not really just one language and culture. And by the way, neither is English. And so we really need to include these cultural components when we do these messages. And I've spoken a lot about this development process. And so if anybody's curious, there's a copy of a talk that I gave at the end of last year with more details on this. So if you take a look at the campaign as a whole, these are our prioritized messages. All of the toolkits that we developed contain English and Spanish versions, and they're editable and customizable. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I think it's really, really important that they be usable by our communities. I mean, the word simple was in my title, right? Well, I'll tell you what I mean by that. First of all, I sat with county judges in rural areas and I said, who in your county distributes flood information? And one county judge looked at me and she goes, you're looking at her. And I said, okay, show me your computer. What programs do you have that you regularly run? Well, PowerPoint came up. I sat with a lot of county officials and consistently found they don't have fancy marketing programs. They don't even have design tools like Canva, but they have PowerPoint. So what we have done is we've designed all of our materials to be completely editable. All the fonts are a basic Arial font. All the colors are a standard blue color that you can access in the standard version of PowerPoint. And the whole reason is all communities want things to talk about their own communities. And so, Waco is a town in Texas. So you could literally add to what's designed here. Are you new to Waco? Well, check your flood risk. Have you tried Texas barbecue yet? Deep in the heart of Texas, there's high water here, and you can totally customize and create these local messages for communities. All right, so now that I talked about the 4 prioritized groups and how we made those messages customizable and simple for communities to use, I'd like to talk about a couple of different community-based approaches, because even though it's a lot of work, y'all, to get involved with communities, it is 100% the way to get communities to trust the information. And it's also the way for us to be sure that what we're developing meets the needs of the community. So I'm going to talk about 2 projects I'm really proud of. One of them I teamed with my rival university, Texas A&M University, the Institute for a Disaster Resilient Texas. And if anybody digs into my background, they're going to find out that I'm actually an Aggie and a Longhorn. And so I have degrees in biochemistry from Texas A&M, and then my social science and organizational communication from UT. And what we were doing is we were going into under-resourced communities to try to figure out what kind of tools we could develop for them to help them better understand their flood risk. I'm going to talk about Fort Hancock, Texas, which is about 60 miles south of El Paso, and it's a colonia. And we went in, and what I mean by that is they have very inadequate drainage, inadequate water, power, basic infrastructure is served by the county, but the county is very rural and very low income. And so we went into this community really open to possibilities. Our project said we wanted to develop digital tools, and my counterparts in Houston, Texas, city, all the time people kept saying, oh, Keri, we could do this. We could develop this dashboard. We could do, and I'm like, I'm not really sure that's what this community needs. And they were so fantastic. They let me work with the community and really figure out what would be useful for this community. This particular community, the last time they were FEMA flood mapped was 1985. Yep, I said that correctly, 1985. And at that time, they had less than 200 people. It has now grown to well over 1,000 people in this community. And everybody kept showing me photos of flooding, but they're in a desert and it's not coming out up from the Rio Grande. So what I found out is it's actually coming down from the mountains. They call them the arroyos, and they stream down through the mountains, and it's pretty catastrophic flooding that's happening almost every single year in the community. So what our team decided to do is to help them collect photographic evidence so that they can work to convince people, because they don't have adequate data in this area of their flooding. They need something to convince and help them get grants and funding to build their infrastructure up. We had a lot of community meetings, and one of the messages that really came out is a result of the fact that one local community, Del City, up in the top that's circled there, it had been recently flood mapped, but the rest of the county hasn't. And so one of the local community members kept telling everybody, you've got to help us get on the map. That's why we want you to share your photos and help us build photographic evidence that flooding is happening. These amazing community partners, they went door to door and collected photographic evidence. And you know that we got 90% of the impacted community to participate. My goal in this project was 30%, and I was worried we would get there. But I think the power of we actually compensated community members. It was their job for a month and a half to go door to door and get community participation. And you can see what kind of positive output resulted. So the last project I'm going to talk about is some work in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas, where we really wanted to better understand how our small businesses are preparing for floods. And so one of the kind of key things we found by talking with small businesses is that a lot of them talk about flooding as just normal. Yeah, it happens every year. I just open one door, open the other door, the water runs through. Well, that's a very scary thing, because if people think it's normal, they think they can't do anything about it. The other thing we found out is a lot of the small business owners are renting, and that impacts how they prepare for floods and respond. And then the other thing is they really want to rely on each other and trusted others for information. So what we ended up developing for the community after over a year-long effort, and I'm really proud of our sandbag story, because we found out they weren't using sandbags properly. And they also didn't know where to get them, what the rules were. And so we created resources in the form of Spanish first resources, which means Spanish appears first, English appears second in this community that was very highly valued and important. We also asked them what would be helpful for, and we had access to graphic designers and we could do graphic novels. No, they looked at us and they said, we'd really like magnets, just magnets that we can put up that everybody can see. So that's what we developed. And then the third thing we did is we collected stories of disaster preparedness from one business owner to another and put them in a guide for the community. So just to kind of recap, I talked about these projects that we're doing in Texas around flood knowledge. We also talked about the community involvement. I will add, because a lot of you are certified floodplain administrators and various other types of flood administrators, we're also doing a project right now where my team is interviewing people who are in those roles to better understand how we could create some type of a tool that would allow you to overlay different forms of both regulatory and non-regulatory data to help make better decisions on a daily basis with your job. I'm super early in that project, but really hope to have a lot of data collected around that by spring of next year. So we're transitioning our thinking about these non-technical audiences away from groups that we're just going to send information to making sure that they're an active part of our design process in these messages and in these projects. And our goal is to make lives better. So I'm really looking forward to, as we continue developing tools that help people better understand flood risk, you know, we've really got to think differently. We have a long way to go. And I'm very excited that, you know, people, at least I've seen a lot of interest in Texas in investing in these types of resources so that we can make a better informed public. So I want to acknowledge, I have a lot of collaborators that are a part of my teams that do these projects. And we also have a lot of funders that have supported this work, ranging from the state of Texas to the National Science Foundation, to various other partners who work with us on these projects. So thank you all so much. I'm looking forward to opening it up to questions and seeing if some of the things we've done in Texas can help you in your communities. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Hopefully, I know most people don't have the privilege of speaking in the webinar, but I think you got some people agreeing with parts of your presentation in the chat, and some questions came in as well. So would love to tee those up for you.
Right.
So, and some of them actually came before the presentation as well. So, but I think that they're still applicable. First one that came in from Carol from the state of Hawaii is, do you have any idea of whether or not a .org versus .gov URL appeal or provide more confidence or trust with people? She also gave a little bit of background in that, like, it seems like the state in Hawaii lost their .org URL at some point, and weren't able to get it back. But they have this like sort of situation where people are still referencing their .org URL. And so I think there's that's like the context to our question.
Wow.
Sounds
So
terrible. I'm sorry, Carol, that happened to you.
yeah, that is terrible. I will tell you that there is definitely some research out there that would suggest that .orgs are more trusted right now. The other thing that I see is if the more local the resource, the more trusted it is. Once we go to a statewide resource or a federal resource, it's just a lot further away from people. And so I think that combination of thinking about ways to get local and thinking about ways to you can partner with organizations that have .orgs. A lot of times I'm seeing a lot of nonprofits who are willing to distribute this information. One of my PhD students is doing our dissertation on how churches are helping to share preparedness information with children. And so a lot of thought around what's trusted. And I that's not going to go away. That's going to be an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. That's surprising too. I would think that .gov would be more trusted, but it makes sense also that
It shifted in the last few years.
Yeah.
Historically, I would say in the early 2000s, we were still at .gov being a more trusted resource. But it's wavering now,
Yeah.
which is
I guess
a real shame because that's who has the
yeah.
expertise, right? But
Definitely, but it does make sense. I guess maybe I have a follow-up question based on Carol's context. You know, she talked a little bit about how some of the materials that have previously been distributed have that .org, and I'm wondering if you have any advice. Like, I think URLs change, guidance changes, right? And so, like, I think as things evolve and you're revising some of your materials, how do you make sure that people aren't still referencing like the old stuff that you've put out?
well, I'll tell you, things need to be taken down on the web is the problem.
Yeah.
Because if it's out there, people are going to access it. Now, I actually think that a better way to go is QR codes. And the reason is you have control on the back end of a QR code
Where it
for
goes.
where you send people. And so I'm seeing a real growth in QR codes for that exact reason, because information does get out of date and the URLs get out of date pretty quickly. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, people are so much more used to QR codes than they were, 5 years
They
ago.
are. They
So
are. And I'll be honest, at first I thought they weren't going to catch on. And I really think that during the pandemic, uh, nobody wanted to use physical menus. And so restaurants and everybody started using them.
yeah,
And I think it's kind of changed behavior as well.
definitely. Yeah, you see it and you just kind of naturally know that you should be scanning it for the
Yeah.
most part. But I'm sure that's bifurcated across different sort of audience segments as well.
It
Um,
is. It is. I would not use them with rural communities where internet access is problematic. I would go to paper based. That's why we have brochures. That's why we still do a lot of tangible materials because it really depends on the audience trying to access the information.
yeah. I guess as it pertains to different audience segments, we have a couple questions maybe that sort of center on that theme. The first one came in from Carol Haddock from Houston. And the question is, while Spanish is a common secondary language, how can we effectively reach out to significant language groups, reach out to other significant language groups within a community?
Yeah, so Carol, you're in Houston, and you are exactly right that Houston has some of the most diverse What's the latest number? I think it's something like 60 different languages that are spoken on a regular basis just in Houston alone. It's a huge number. So if you take a look at the charts, the one thing I actually just put in a proposal talking about this exact issue, Spanish is just so dominant as a first language after English in the United States, most dominant. But then we have actually Vietnamese that is next throughout the country. I think that on a local level, if you prioritize the languages that are spoken, and we have AI-based tools that are doing a really good job at translating, but just like I said a while ago, you need to do more than translate. You also need to make sure that what's included in that is culturally appropriate. And so what I would do is I would also pull in members of the organizations of those communities that are speaking other languages, have them double check the materials that are being crafted. And a lot of times they want to be involved in those processes. So that combination of more advanced translation tools along with these more culture-centered approaches, I think are the way to do it.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I think per your previous comment around sort of partnering with community-based organizations, it seems like community-based organizations that sort of serve those language groups are a great way to disseminate, whatever it is that you do create. So
yeah.
appreciate that. I realized two things. The first one is that we got two questions from Carol's back to back. So if there's anyone else named Carol in the audience and you have a question, this is your moment to be part of the crew. But secondarily, I do want to call out that Keri did share a QR code here. So walking the walk, if you do want to scan that and get some of the resources, we will share the presentation after this as well. But appreciate that answer. I think sort of similarly, a different kind of audience question from Julie Lomax is, do you have any experience with outreach for students in particular relative to flood risk?
Wow, students. Okay, so we actually have, thank you for reminding me that. I need to put that in the recommendations for Texas. One of the things that we've seen with students is that they usually come from a lot of different locations. So they tend to fall into our newcomer group. And I'll give you a concrete example. I was at a back to school event in the fall, and someone had just seen a presentation I gave, and she was from another state, and she said, I think Washington, and she said, oh, Austin doesn't have any disasters, do they? We don't need to be prepared for anything. And I was like, oh gosh, let me tell you about tornadoes. And then I was like, oh man, this is pretty bad. I don't want to freak them out. But you know what? Our students need resources. We have found very few that are designed specifically for students. But I think this idea of tapping into what we've uncovered about newcomers and then tapping into a second phenomena that happens with young adults, and that is they're often on their own for the first time and making a lot of decisions for themselves as an adult without a lot of experience doing so. And so providing them access to, accurate information is so important. And it's also got to be provided in the right formats. So everything that I do for students, I don't use Facebook. They're not on Facebook because I'm on there, right? Our age group's on that. I use Instagram, and I can't use in the state of Texas TikTok, but TikTok is where all of those messages are happening for that demographic. So, they're important. They're really important. And we don't have a lot of resources out there for them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's also a follow-up question here. I think it's like sort of slightly related. And the question is, do you have any information on the reading ability / level of the audience for outreach? So maybe just sort of speaking to my interpretation of this question is just,
yes.
Is there a level that is appropriate for outreach in general?
Yes. So there is, and I can't ever say this right, but the Flesch-Kincaid Index is something that you can put your messages in and try to see what level it's showing up. We really want to shoot for about a 6th grade level on everything, just because we don't know where people are falling. And I'll also tell you, when it comes to something like statistics, and when we're talking about risk, y'all, we learned about probabilities when we were in about the second or third grade for the first time. And then we learned about them again in about the sixth grade. And we've been learning about them throughout our whole lives, but there is something about it that it's just not intuitive for a lot of people to remember. So I would say that if you're dealing with numbers, try to not target a grade level. Try to really target whether you include visual information, graphics, images, in addition to the text. That combination seems to work best in terms of reaching people with this complex risk information.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And then Carol from the state of Hawaii chimed in the Q&A. So we're having a full conversation with her in the Q&A.
Awesome.
But on the topic of reaching out to younger adults, but then also sort of younger individuals, she noted that reaching out to elementary students is a great way to bring the conversation of flood risk into the home or to the family, to like the dinner table. I think that's a great point to make as well.
So I agree very much. And I have another team member who does something called, she studies language brokering. And what she does is she works with children who speak both English and Spanish and looks at how they translate. We're doing a project right now about helping communities in El Paso learn how to wrap their pipes so they don't break in cold weather. And we're actually going to be training those elementary and junior high school age young girls in particular about how to wrap their pipes, working with the Girl Scouts, hoping to get a new patch for them to be able to put on their uniforms. And so lots of opportunities to work with that age group in both English and Spanish and other languages as well.
Yeah, that sounds so empowering. I feel like I would have really been excited to learn that as a child.
I know I keep pushing our team and wanting to get to the training part of it and working with the young adults, but we're still doing the research. So when we get there, I can't wait. I'm going to be on the ground doing that work. Yeah.
You'll be there with bells on. So I guess this is a question for me because, you know, you've been talking about sort of iteratively testing messages and the importance of that and like sort of what is impactful and what isn't impactful. I'm wondering if you have any advice for anyone who is like wanting to sort of test messaging locally, sort of what kinds of questions do you ask to see if not, you know, certain type of messaging is impactful?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. The way that we approach it is we don't lead with the message that we think might work. We often will ask open-ended questions and ask them what they've seen. So the way that we got to this message for young males, young adult males, was through asking them if they'd seen Turn Around, Don't Drown.
Right.
And first of all, they told us they hadn't, which was shocking because they all drove in our focus groups. And so we showed them a picture of it and we asked them what they thought the sign meant. And then we pulled up another sign, which, by the way, this is really problematic. Low water crossing. Oh my gosh. Do you know how many people told me, oh, that means there's just a low amount of the water on the road, so I can go right through that.
You can cross. Yeah, you just know there's water.
So, you know, we start with existing messaging that's out there and try to figure out where the confusion points and where might we be able to make a difference with this particular group. And I think that by starting a lot more broadly and then narrowing in, and that's why a lot of times this needs to be iterative and you need to work with groups over time to try to figure out what works. It took us about 6 different iterations of focus groups to get to our message for the young adult males, keep your car high and dry.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you're getting a suggestion, actually, maybe it could be added to driver's education programs as well.
Oh, absolutely. So the other thing about driver's ed is I have a few students who have recently taken it, and they've told me that there's very little in there about it. And that would be an ideal place to try to educate that age demographic. And the survey that my team just did suggests that that message also works for young adult women as well. And so it seems to be for people who don't own a home yet, their most prized possession is their vehicle. That's what we need to tap into and remind them is at risk when they feel invincible and they don't think their life is at risk.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think a follow-up question on kind of testing messages, methodology more broadly, if you're not a researcher by trade, maybe you're a floodplain manager in a local community, but you
Yeah.
do want to start to like be a little bit more methodical about testing messaging, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit more about like sort of what is like a good process to run? Do you just pull together a group of people and ask questions? How do you ask the questions? Do you use a poll? How do you get participation, et cetera?
Mm.
Please let me know, whoever typed that question, if I misconstrued your question.
Okay, so that is a very real question that I think a lot of people face. So they're not researchers, they're not going to be designing these elaborate questionnaire and open-ended interview guides that my team would necessarily develop. I would say a couple of key things to think about, and one is, who do you want to reach? And really pull in that group of people, because there was Germany launched a countrywide effort to educate around flood risk, very elaborate message, a single message going to the entire country. 2 and 3 and 4 years later, it was evaluated. Do you know it had zero effect on changing behavior?
Oh no,
I think, and
not
the
what you
reason
want
for
to
that,
see.
well, it's not, but the reason is it wasn't targeted to any particular audience. People would see it and they were like, yeah, 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 that's meant for somebody else. So my first piece of advice is think about who you want to reach, because targeting your messages is absolutely key. Pull those people in. And then my second piece of advice is write out a bunch of open-ended questions and just think about it as, let's pick their brain about how they think about whatever it is that you're trying to work with. And asking them open-ended questions is really key. A lot of people think they can survey a broad audience and get meaningful data. And it takes a lot of work to do that. I think the better approach is targeting and asking those open-ended questions.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like going on a date or something, right? Where you're just like, I'm not going to make assumptions about what I know about you. I just like actually want to know who you are and what you value. Okay, a
Great way to
couple
think
more.
about it. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple more questions and hopefully we can squeeze them both in. So I guess we talked about a few sort of different audience segments that people were interested in sort of exploring outside of what you presented. And so this question is, are there tools or research for communicating flood risk and preparedness to people living in RV parks or mobile home parks in floodplains? Because oftentimes they're very high risk in different flooding events.
So they're very high risk, and they are listed as one of the things we did as our project before we chose our 4 prioritized groups, is we did a deep dive and came up with about 40 to 50 different groups that could be targeted with information. And that group is one of them, because they do have very unique needs. Some of those communities are also a lot more transient. We have along the Gulf Coast a lot of people who only live in some of our mobile home parks for a certain part of the week, and then they leave. So their work is there, and then they leave and go to another place. I have not come across any resources. If anybody has them for this group, I would love if you put it in the chat and share it with her. It's just a lot of people have talked about the fact they need resources. So I wish I could tell you I had these magic resources there, but I don't. I am going to recommend that the state of Texas look into that group, though,
Yeah.
and that we develop messages for them. And they're willing to put some more resources behind expanding from the 4 groups up to about, I think, at least 10, if not more, prioritized groups.
Yeah, that makes sense. We did see people sort of talked a little bit about the state of West Virginia's flood risk communication website. If anybody else has great examples,
Yeah.
question or just in general in terms of communication, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll share them with the group. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more, but there's only 3 more minutes, so hopefully
Okay.
I can do this. But Holly's question is quite interesting. All that just came in. So this one is from Sarah from the city and county of Honolulu. How do you justify and build additional funds into a project scope to cover effective outreach? So how do you get some of those projects funded?
One of the things that for at least a decade before I got people to kind of see the light, I was very frustrated by the fact that everybody wanted quick answers to solve these problems.
Yeah.
What I have started doing is I've said, well, you can do that, but would you like to look at what Germany did and the outcome of all the money that they spent? And so a lot of times I'm pointing to, you can do a lot of different things, but do you want it to make a difference? And if you want it to make a difference, there are now tried and true ways to involve the community that involves more time and more money, but it actually is going to get you a better outcome. And so trying to have those conversations is important. I will tell you something exciting is that the National Science Foundation, that I get a lot of my funding from, they will allow me now to build in a community component. I pay my community members when they provide data, when they participate in the process, because I believe it's an equity and an equitable way to get participation. And so building in these mechanisms to show how you value their participation is super important. If you ask people to volunteer their time, you will get a very specific demographic that is able to volunteer their time.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Okay, last question is, and I promise that this is, so Holly Strand, who actually does flood risk communications for the state of Utah, asked an interesting question around whether or not you ever use social listening software or social media monitoring to gather information about your communication audience.
Absolutely. I actually give a talk tomorrow on what I call human AI teaming. And so we've actually done a lot of research on emergency response. I'm actually looking into right now the Valencia in Spain related flooding issues because I've done a little bit of work even in Europe, and these can be incredibly powerful tools. There's a problem, and the biggest problem is that right now, Twitter, now X, used to be the go-to platform for a lot of the social listening that we were doing, and it's the demographics of who's using it have shifted drastically. And so we're using Reddit data, but that's also a very specific demographic. And there's almost no way to get Facebook or Nextdoor data. I actually have, and I think in the QR code, you can access some of my research papers where we actually did get access to private Facebook and social media data. But you want to talk about labor intensive. It was sitting next to people, spending an hour building rapport, and then having them voluntarily share whatever they would allow us to have, to then be able to do our machine learning and look at what patterns we were seeing in the data, sentiment analysis, and very other types of tools. It's super promising. But this is the issue right now, is we've lost the platform that I think most people were using, and that's Twitter and X.
That totally makes sense. It sounds like we should be monitoring your research as it comes out, because you have a lot of things in the works we'll be really excited to learn about. I know we're 1 minute over, so thank you everyone for staying, and thank you especially to Keri for joining us and answering all of our questions. I think it was
Thank y'all.
I really appreciate your time. There's a post-attendee survey after this, so please fill that out, and we'll also send you the recording, etc., in an email. Thank you again, and thank you to all of our audience members.